Hello there, squirrel friends. We are on chapter 10 of 450 from Paddington, or what Miss McGillicuddy saw. Chapter 10, part 1. I have candy stuck on the fruity Tootsie Rolls and stuck on the roof of my mouth. So if I'm sucking, you'll know. Or if I talk funny. Miss Marple, sitting erect against a background of china dogs and presents from Margate, smiled approvingly at Inspector Dermot Craddock. "I'm so glad," she said, "that you've been assigned to the case. I hoped you would be." "When I got your letter," said Craddock, "I took it straight to the AC. As it happened, he had just heard from the Brackhampton people calling us in. They seemed to think it wasn't a local crime." Okay, what's the AC? "The AC was very interested in what I had to tell him about you. He'd heard about you, I gathered, from my godfather." "Dear Sir Henry," murmured Miss Marple affectionately. "He got me to tell him all about the little Paddocks business. Do you want to hear what he said next?" "Please tell me if it's not a breach of confidence." "He said, well, as this seems a completely cockeyed business, all thought up by a couple of old ladies who've turned out, against all probability to be right, and since you already know one of these old ladies, I'm sending you down on the case, so here I am. And now, my dear Miss Marple, where do we go from here? This is not, as you probably appreciate, an official visit. I haven't got my henchman with me. I thought you and I might take down our back hair together first." Miss Marple smiled at him. "I'm sure," she said, "that no one who only knows you officially would ever guess that you could be so human and better looking than ever. Don't blush. Now, what exactly have you been told so far?" "I've got everything, I think. Your friend Mrs. McGillicuddy's original statement to the police at St. Mary Mead, confirmation of her statement by the ticket collector, and also the note to the station master at Brackhampton. I may say that all the proper inquiries were made by the people concerned, the railway people and the police. But there's no doubt that you outsmarted them all by a most fantastic process of guesswork." "Not guesswork," said Miss Marple, "and I had a great advantage. I knew Elspeth McGillicuddy. Nobody else did. And there was no obvious confirmation of her story, and if there was no question of any woman being reported missing, then quite naturally they would think it was just an elderly lady imagining things, as elderly ladies often do, but not Elspeth McGillicuddy." "Not Elspeth McGillicuddy," agreed the inspector. "I'm looking forward to meeting her, you know. I wish she hadn't gone to Ceylon. We're arranging for her to be interviewed there, by the way. My own process of reasoning was not really original," said Miss Marple. "It's all in Mark Twain, the boy who found the horse. He just imagined," what in the world? "Where he would go if he was a horse. He went there and there was a horse, or there was the horse. You imagined what you'd do if you were a cruel and cold-blooded murderer?" said Craddock, looking thoughtfully at Miss Marple's pink and white elderly fragility. Really, you're mine like a sink, my nephew Raymond used to say. Mrs. Marple agreed, nodding her head briskly, but as I always told him, sinks are necessary domestic equipment, and actually very hygienic. Can you go a little further still, put yourself in the murderer's place, and tell me just where he is now? Miss Marple sighed. I wish I could. I've no idea at all, but he must be someone who has lived in or knows all about Rutherford Hall. I agree, but that opens up a very wide field. Quite a succession of daily women have worked there. I found out what this pain is in my right foot. This old lady's in her pains. A torn tendon. Anyway. Where am I? Wide field, a succession of women. There's the Women's Institute and the ARP wardens before them. They all know the long barn and the sarcophagus and where the key was kept. The whole setup there is widely known locally. Anybody living round about might hit on it as a good spot for his purpose. Yes, indeed, I quite understand your difficulties, Craddock said. We'll never get anywhere until we identify the body. And that too may be difficult. Oh, we'll get there in the end. We're checking up on all the reported disappearances of a woman of that age and appearance. There's no one outstanding who fits the bill. The M.O. puts her down as about 35, healthy, probably a married woman who has had at least one child. Her fur coat is a cheap one purchased at a London store. Hundreds of such coats were sold in the last 3 months, about 60% of them to blonde women. No salesgirl can recognize the photograph of the dead woman, or is likely to if the purchase were made just before Christmas. Her other clothes seem mainly of foreign manufacture, mostly purchased in Paris. There are no English laundry marks. We've communicated with Paris, and they're checking up there for us. Sooner or later, of course, someone will come forward with a missing relative or lodger. It's just a matter of time. The compact wasn't any help? Unfortunately, no. It's a type sold by the 100 in the Rue de Rivoli, quite cheap. By the way, you ought to have turned that over to the police at once, you know, or rather, Miss Islesborough should have done so. Miss Marple shook her head, but at that moment there wasn't any question of a crime having been committed, she pointed out. If a young lady practicing golf shots picks up an old compact of no particular value in the long grass, surely she doesn't rush straight off to the police with it? Miss Marple paused and then added firmly, I thought it much wiser to find the body first. Inspector Craddock was tickled. You don't seem ever to have any doubts but that it would be found? I was sure it would. Lucy Islesborough is a most efficient and intelligent person. I'll say she is. She scares the life out of me. She's so devastatingly efficient. No man will ever dare marry that girl. Now, you know, I wouldn't say that. It would have to be a special type of man, of course. Miss Marple brooded on this thought a moment. How's she getting on at Rutherford Hall? They're completely dependent on her as far as I can see, eating out of her hand, literally, as you might say. By the way, they know nothing about her connection with you. We've kept that dark. She has no connection now with me. She has done what I asked her to do. So she could hand in her notice and go if she wanted to? Yes. But she stops on. Why? Stops on? She has not mentioned her reasons to me. She's a very intelligent girl. I suspect that she has become interested. In the problem or in the family? It may be, said Miss Marple, that it's rather difficult. It may be that it is rather difficult to separate the two. Craddock looked hard at her. Oh, no. Oh, dear me, no. Have you got anything particular in mind? I think you have. Miss Marple shook her head. Dermot Craddock sighed. So all I can do is to prosecute my inquiries, to put it in jargon. A policeman's life is a dull one. You'll get results, I'm sure. Any ideas for me? More inspired guesswork? I was thinking of things like theatrical companies, said Miss Marple rather vaguely. And touring from place to place and perhaps not many home ties. One of these young women would be much less likely to be missed. Yes, perhaps you've got something there. We'll pay special attention to that angle, he added. What are you smiling about? I was just thinking, said Miss Marple, of Elspeth McGillicuddy's face when she hears we found the body. Part 2. Well, said Mrs. McGillicuddy, well. Words failed her. She looked across at the nicely spoken, pleasant young man who had called upon her with official credentials, and then down at the photograph that he handed her. That's her, all right, she said. Yes, that's her, poor soul. Well, I must say, I'm glad you found her body. Nobody believed a word I said, the police or the railway people or anyone else. It's very galling not to be believed. At any rate, nobody could say I didn't do all I possibly could. The nice young man made sympathetic and appreciative noises. Where did you say the body was found? In a barn at a house called Rutherford Hall, just outside Brackhampton. Never heard of it. How did it get there, I wonder? The young man didn't reply. Jane Marple found it, I suppose. Trust Jane. The body, said the young man, referring to some notes, was found by a Miss Lucy Islesborough. Never heard of her either, said Mrs. McGillicuddy. I still think Jane Marple had something to do with it. Anyway, Mrs. McGillicuddy, you definitely identify this picture as that of the woman whom you saw in a train? Being strangled by a man? Yes, I do. Now, can you describe this man? He was a tall man, said Mrs. McGillicuddy. Yes, and dark. Yes. That's all I can tell you, said Mrs. McGillicuddy. He had his back to me. I didn't see his face. Would you be able to recognize him if you saw him? Of course I shouldn't. He had his back to me. I never saw his face. You've no idea at all as to his age? Mrs. McGillicuddy considered. No, not really. I don't know. He wasn't, I'm almost sure, very young. His shoulders looked, well, set, if you know what I mean. The young man nodded. 30 and upward. I can't get closer than that. I wasn't really looking at him, you see. It was her with those hands around her throat and her face all blue. You know, sometimes I dream of it, even now. It must have been a distressing experience, said the young man sympathetically. He closed his notebook and said, When are you returning to England? Not for another 3 weeks. It isn't necessary, is it, for me? He quickly reassured her. Oh, no, there's nothing you can do at present. Of course, if we make an arrest. It was left like that. The mail brought a letter from Miss Marple to her friend. The writing was spiky and spidery and heavily underlined. Long practice made it easy for Mrs. McGillicuddy to decipher. Miss Marple wrote a very full account to her friend, who devoured every word with great satisfaction. She and Jane had shown them all right. And that's all of 10. But I think I'll go on to 11. Part 1. I simply can't make you out, said Cedric Crackenthorpe. He eased himself down on the decaying wall of a long derelict pigsty and stared at Lucy Owlsparrow. What can't you make out? What you're doing here? I'm earning my living? As a skivvy? He spoke despairingly. You're out of date, said Lucy. Skivvy, indeed. I'm a household help, a professional domestician, or an answer to prayer, mainly the latter. You can't like all the things you have to do, cooking and making beds and worrying about with a hoopla or whatever you call it, and sinking your arms up to your elbows in greasy water, Lucy laughed. Not the details, perhaps, but cooking satisfies my creative instincts, and there's something in me that really revels in clearing up mess. I live in a permanent mess, said Cedric. I like it, he added defiantly. You look as though you did. My cottage in Ibiza is run on simple, straightforward lines. 3 plates, 2 cups and saucers, a bed, a table, and a couple of chairs. There's dust everywhere. And smears of paint and chips of stone. I sculpt as well as paint, and nobody's allowed to touch a thing. I won't have a woman near the place. Not in any capacity? What do you mean by that? I was assuming that a man of such artistic taste presumably had some kind of love life. My love life, as you call it, is my own business, said Cedric with dignity. What I won't have is a woman in here tidying up, interfering bossing capacity. How I'd love to have a go at your cottage, said Lucy. It would be a challenge. You won't get the opportunity. I suppose not. Some bricks fell out of the pigsty. Cedric turned his head and looked into its nettle-ridden depths. Dear old Madge, he said, I remember her well, a sow of most endearing disposition and prolific mother. 17 in the last litter, I remember. We used to come here on fine afternoons and scratch Madge's back with a stick. She loved it. Why has this whole place been allowed to get into the state it's in? It can't only be the war. You'd like to tidy this up too, I suppose? What an interfering female you are. I quite see now why you would be the person to discover a body. You couldn't even leave a Greco-Roman sarcophagus alone. He paused and then went on. No, it's not only the war, it's my father. What do you think of him, by the way? I haven't had much time for thinking. Don't evade the issue. He's as mean as hell and, in my opinion, a bit crazy as well. Of course, he hates all of us, except perhaps Emma. That's because of my grandfather's will. Lucy looked inquiring. I started to do something. I forgot what it was. My grandfather was the man who... Oh, Lordy. Grandfather was the man who made a monich with the crunchies and the cracker jacks and the cozy crisps, all the afternoon tea delicacies, and then, being farsighted, he switched on very early to cheesies and canopies so that now we cash in on cocktail parties in a big way. Well, the time came when Father intimated that he had a soul above crunchies. So weird. He traveled in Italy and the Balkans and Greece and dabbled in art. My grandfather was peeved. He decided my father was no man of business and a rather poor judge of art, quite right in both cases. So left all his money in trust for his grandchildren. Father had the income for life, but he couldn't touch the capital. Do you know what he did? He stopped spending money. He came here and began to save. I'd say that by now he's accumulated nearly as big a fortune as my grandfather left. And in the meantime, all of us, Harold, myself, Alfred, and Emma, haven't got a penny of grandfather's money. I'm a stony broke painter. Harold went into business and is now a prominent man. In the city, he's the one with the money-making touch. Though I've heard rumors that he's in Queer Street lately. Alfred is usually known in the privacy of the family as Flash Alf. Why? What a lot of things you want to know. The answer is that Alf is the black sheep of the family. He's not actually been to prison yet, but he's been very near it. He was in the Ministry of Supply during the war, but left it rather abruptly under questionable circumstances. And after that, there were some dubious deals in tinned fruits and trouble over eggs. Nothing in a big way, just a few doubtful deals on the side. Isn't it rather unwise to tell strangers all these things? Why, are you a police spy? I might be. I don't think so. You were here slaving away before the police began to take an interest in us, I should say. He broke off as his sister Emma came through the door of the kitchen garden. Hello, Em. You're looking very perturbed about something. I am. I want to talk to you, Cedric. I must get back to the house, said Lucy tactfully. Don't go, said Cedric. Murder has made you practically one of the family. I got a lot to do, said Lucy. I only came out to get some parsley. She beat a rapid retreat to the kitchen garden. Cedric's eyes followed her. Good-looking girl, he said. Who is she, really? Oh, she's quite well known, said Emma. She's made a speciality of this kind of thing, but never mind, Lucy Owlsborough, Cedric. I'm terribly worried. Apparently the police think that the dead woman was a foreigner, perhaps French. Cedric, you don't think she could possibly be Martine? Martine. And part 2. For a moment or two, Cedric stared at her as though uncomprehending. Martine? But who on earth? Oh, you mean Martine? Yes, do you think? Why on earth should it be Martine? Well, her sending that telegram was odd when you come to think of it. It must have been roughly about the same time. Do you think that she may, after all, have come down here and... Nonsense. Why should Martine come down here and find her way into the long barn? What for? It seems wildly unlikely to me. You don't think, perhaps, that I ought to tell Inspector Bacon or the other one? Tell him what? Well, about Martine, about her letter. Now, don't you go complicating things, sir. No, sorry. Now, don't you go complicating things, sis, by bringing up a lot of irrelevant stuff that has nothing to do with all this. I was never very convinced about that letter from Martine. Anyway, I was. You've always been good at believing impossible things before breakfast, old girl. My advice to you is sit tight and keep your mouth shut. It's up to the police to identify their precious corpse, and I bet Harold would say the same." "Oh, I know Harold would, and Alfred also, but I'm worried, Cedric. I really am worried. I don't know what I ought to do." "Nothing," said Cedric promptly. "You keep your mouth shut, Emma. Never go halfway to meet trouble. That's my motto." Emma Crackenthorpe sighed. She went slowly back to the house, uneasily in her mind. As she came into the drive, Dr. Quimper emerged from the house and opened the door of his battered Austin car. He paused while he saw her, then, leaving the car, he came towards her. "Well, Emma," he said, "your father's in splendid shape. Murder suits him. It's given him an interest in life. I must recommend it for more of my patients, Lord." Emma smiled mechanically. Dr. Quimper was always quick to notice reactions. "Anything particular the matter?" he asked. Emma looked up at him. She'd come to rely a lot on the kindness and sympathy of the doctor. He had become a friend on whom to lean, not only a medical attendant. His calculated brusqueness did not deceive her. She knew the kindness that lay behind it. Lord. "I'm worried, yes," she admitted. "Care to tell me? Don't if you don't want to. I'd like to tell you. Some of it you know already. The point is, I don't know what to do." "You should say your judgment was usually most reliable. What's the trouble?" "You remember, perhaps you don't, what I once told you about my brother, the one who was killed in the war?" "You mean about his having married or wanting to marry a French girl, something of that kind?" "Yes, almost immediately after I got that letter he was killed. We never heard anything of or about the girl." This always happens when I'm reading. "Yes, almost immediately after I got that letter he was killed. Never heard anything of or about the girl. All we knew actually was her Christian name. We always expected her to write or turn up, but she didn't. We never heard anything until about a month ago, just before Christmas. I remember you got a letter, didn't you?" "Yes, saying she was in England and would like to come and see us. It was all arranged. And then, at the last minute, she sent a wire that she had to return unexpectedly to France." "Well?" "The police think this woman who was killed was French." "They do they?" She looked more of an English type to me, but one can't really judge. "What's worrying you then? Is that just possibly the dead woman might be your brother's girl?" "Yes. I think it's most unlikely," said Dr. Quimper, adding, "but all the same, I understand what you feel." "I'm wondering if I ought not to tell the police about it all. Cedric and the others say it's quite unnecessary. What do you think?" Dr. Quimper pursed his lips. He was silent for a moment or two, deep in thought, and then he said, almost unwillingly, "It's much simpler, of course. If you say nothing, I can understand what your brothers feel about it." "All the same, yes." Quimper looked at her. His eyes had an affectionate twinkle in them. "I'd go ahead and tell 'em," he said. "You'll go on worrying if you don't. I know you." Emma flushed a little. She flashed. "Perhaps I'm foolish." You do what you want to do, my dear, and let the rest of the family go hang. I'd back your judgment against the lot of them any day. Yay! I read 10 and 11, didn't I? So we'll be on 12. Whoop, whoop. Y'all have a good night, good sleep. It's 10:46 p.m. Eastern on today, Friday night. Be sweet, don't be ugly. See you tomorrow at 3, I hope. Bye-bye.